When I went back to the UK, my early 20s, after living here for a while, I got a job on a dairy farm after a year or so, and it was about 900 cows. But for the 6 months or so of winter, they were inside sheds all day, every day, and I never left a concrete yard. So it was a lot of, obviously loads of feed that was grown on the farm. Also quite a lot of imported concentrates and stuff that would be fed in the shed, and other feeds that were brought in. So, we never put a cow on grass until kind of middle end of April. But then I was away, and, I was kind of doing stuff like the New Zealand grazing style, breaking up paddocks and, growing a bit more grass really. So yeah, it was a complete flip on what I'd always done. Obviously growing up in the UK, I'd always kind of seen farming kind of out the window. I had mates on farms, but never really got in it and done it. So it was a bit of an eye-opener, but I guess because of the way that I felt comfortable doing stuff when I managed my first farm in the UK, I think I was about 23, but it was a beef farm, about 500 hectares or so. I wanted to get away from dairy basically after that kind of big 900 cow indoor system kind of thing. Took the love out of milking a bit, but the beef thing, I just did what I knew, which was quite different to the way it had been done on that farm previously. So I got everything in fewer, bigger mobs, moved them around a lot more often, paid more attention to kind of residuals and grazing covers, took a lot of the inputs out. We took a lot of the kind of concentrated feeds out of the system. I'd never really liked the idea of using chemicals, whether that's fert or herbicides or whatever. So I always kind of stayed away from those kinds of jobs on the farm out here. So kind of when I was calling the shots a bit more, it was quite easy for me to walk away from those and try and do it organically, although without certification. And just kind of played with what I thought felt right, as well as what I kind of knew how to do. And yeah, I think that farm in the couple of years that I was there, we saw quite a lot of changes. The cost of production went down a lot. Output went up as well. Input costs went down, obviously. So they had all the sheds and the barns there, but essentially I kept most things outside through the winter. So started playing with ideas that felt very normal for New Zealand, but were unusual in the UK. In the UK, you kind of got to bank that for 6 months of the year or so, you're not really going to get any grass growth. And it can be wet, as I've said, this winter it's rained pretty much every day. So if you're not hot on how you manage your grazing in the winter, it can become a bit of a mess, which is why I think the industry in general has kind of ended up with most livestock being housed indoors. In general, obviously, there's people that aren't doing that, but that's the kind of the general scope of what the system looks like in the UK.
Yeah, did you feel any kind of pushback for you trying to take animals outside on those first farms that you managed?
I guess there was some question marks. Like, they certainly liked having lots of different mobs. You'd have like different breeding mobs of cows, and you'd have like the 1-year-old heifers and the 1-year-old steers in two different groups, and the 2-year-old heifers and steers in a separate group. So you're driving around all day just checking stock before you'd even really got around to doing anything. So, and again, they were just in pretty large areas, just kind of set stocked for weeks on end before you'd move them on. So lots of overgrazing basically. And so, yeah, when I started doing all that quite differently, and you couldn't just go and look at your R2s, heifers or whatever. You had to go and pick them out from the steers and the 1-year-olds and everything else. So, I think it ruffled a few feathers. The outwintering stuff, probably. I think that the old guy, he wasn't a farmer that owned it. He was stuck in his ways a bit with some of the breeding and genetics, which I wanted to push to change to kind of get animals that fitted that system a bit better. But essentially, one of the key bits of feedback I got from him when I left was I was the first farm manager in 25 years that really made a profit. So, I think he saw actually that the value in it kind of made sense, despite it being a bit of a shock at the start, really.
Yeah, and I suppose that helps with that paradigm shift for him as well, is that you're making money and the previous farm managers weren't. So that kind of backs up what you're doing on farm.
Yeah, and for me, I always try and think, and I made a lot of mistakes back then, don't get me wrong. I'd gone and done a postgraduate thing in agriculture just to kind of fill in lots of gaps so I could kind of jump up that ladder and have more of a managerial role. But those first 2 years was quite a learning curve. There's quite a lot of legislation and stuff in the UK as well, and lots of things around subsidy and environment and all that kind of stuff. So the stuff around environment and doing stuff on farm to facilitate that, as long as with all the paperwork, there's quite a lot to learn. Certainly wasn't like the perfect model system of how to do it, but I think what it did, it gave me the freedom to play with the things that I enjoyed about farming, and also experiment a bit with stuff that I thought felt right, and you got the feedback loop of what happened when you did that, and it gave you a bit more confidence to push it. And I guess that kind of teed me up really to kind of go down a bit more of my deep dive into organics and more regenerative grazing systems. So it was a good learning curve for sure.
Cool. Can you tell us a bit more about FAI Farm and your current role there? You've been there for about 4 years now, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. About 3 years actually. But I guess there's a chapter just before FAI. So I moved on from that first job and set up a beef farm and set up a farm butchery as well. So the whole point of that was direct selling. So it was really finding a key unique selling point, why people wanted to pay more for our beef basically and come straight to us. And that's really where I went down the deep rabbit hole of kind of regen ag and kind of a lot of those grazing principles that were definitely different from the way that I'd done it, say, here on like more conventional pastoral rotational New Zealand systems. I did that for a few years, really loved it, but I really had this kind of light bulb moment there that this was the thing that I found really interesting in farming and where I wanted to kind of put my time and attention and how I wanted to do stuff going forward. So that was great. We had loads of amazing feedback of that place and people getting excited about the brand and the product and all that kind of thing. It was quite small scale. So when I found a job at FAI, so FAI they're a supply chain research and consultancy company working with big global food brands. So they've done a lot over the years with poultry systems, aquaculture, all over the world. There's people based in Brazil and America and Thailand and Norway, as well as the UK, and I think they've even got someone in New Zealand actually. So there's a lot going on basically. But I joined them, so they're about just under 600 hectare farm right on the edge of Oxford, and they were mapping with lots of data for a formal research project what the transition of that farm looked like to get from quite conventionally managed in an organic sense to a full AMP grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing system. So for me, I guess there's nuances in that. I guess it's like mob grazing or holistically planned grazing, but we call it AMP grazing. Basically, we like the word adaptive, so it's not too kind of linear and this is how you do it and this is the plan. It is there's room in that you need to move and adapt in what you're seeing. But for me, that was like, right, well, if I'm really sold on this whole kind of regenerative ag grazing systems, then for me, FAI would look like a great foundational platform to try and help transcend that system into bigger supply chains around the world. So it took a deep dive across soil health, cattle performance, livestock performance, environment, biodiversity, and even some kind of social factors of kind of how staff and the community around how they felt through the change in the system as well.
That's cool. So you kind of did it on a small scale with the butchery farm previously, and then you're trying to scale that up with FAI farms and take your learnings and then put that through research so that other farms can learn how to do it?
Yeah, exactly. So, I at the middle farm, the smaller one, is a place called English Farm. It was in Oxfordshire as well, just kind of 45 minutes out of London probably. But what I noticed there was this real buzz and excitement in and around regenerative systems. Like when you start talking about how the grazing system in place is bringing biodiversity back, it's dealing with droughts much more effectively. It's I guess less intensive in some ways, but can still give you sufficient production on like a couple hundred acres in the UK. It's pretty hard to make money in a commercial system. So lots of smaller scale, 50 acres up to a couple of hundred or whatever, a lot of those guys are direct selling. So what that did, it gave me a vehicle to interact with the public and chefs and butchers, journalists, all that kind of stuff. And I've found quite quick how excited people outside or up the industry get about this stuff. So, we're quite a lot of high-end, like Michelin star chefs that were using it. They weren't just using it, they were talking about it on their menu. And people were like going to their restaurants because they wanted to buy that product. Again, a lot of people wanted to come to the farm, and we did like pop-up dinner events. It's all about how do we increase the value of the product as well. So if you've got 200 acres, right? If you make twice as much money per annum, or you've essentially doubled your acreage or doubled your stocking rate. So that's how that kind of worked out. But it became right. Well, if the general public and other people in the supply chain are this excited and passionate about what we're doing, what we were doing and talking about, then for me, it felt like there was definitely legs for it to go up. And that's why the going up that scale. And at FAI as well, research farm, we have a lot of interaction with farmers. We have a lot of groups coming to the farm, as well as like industry people, big corporations and researchers and government people as well. Because obviously we can show what we're doing and they can come to the farm and see it with their own eyes, but we've also got that data behind to kind of support that story.